everybody. Welcome to those of you here in the room, and welcome to those of you joining us at home. I'm Henny Hale. I'm the co-director of Independent Dance, which is a development and learning organisation for expanded dance practices based at Siobhan Davis Studios in London. So I'm just going to do a brief audio description. I'm fair-skinned with freckles. I've got brown hair in a ponytail. I'm wearing a white top, and I'm in a studio theatre with a fairly, I think my background's quite dark. So I'm delighted to be hosting this talk, Dance, Intimacy and the Civic, here at Sadler's Wells Lilian Baylis, in a hybrid format. So I've got Charlotte Spencer here sitting next to me in the studio, and we have a gathered audience in the studio. And then we also have Marwa Al Sabouni speaking online from her home in Homs in Syria. And there's several of you also in wherever you are, all over the world. And so this is a sort of fairly irregular format for a lot of us. I'm speaking to you on a camera. When I speak to Marwa, I kind of want to look at her over there, but actually I know that I need to speak to the camera. So you need to just bear with us. Sometimes it might be quite unfamiliar, this format for both our speakers. And also just the mode of delivering a presentation might be quite unfamiliar. So thank you. I also want to welcome our two British Sign Language interpreters. So we have Steve Hudson and Peter Abraham joining us. I'm delighted they can be with us this evening too. This is the second in a series of talks under the title Dance, Intimacy and the Civic, produced in partnership with Sadler's Wells and University of Roehampton. The series looks at relationships between dance and choreographic practices, along with various other practices of social organizing, civic structuring, social care, and ways of being together. And particularly now, in this current context that we're in, with inequality, pandemic related, and the geopolitical conflict that we find ourselves, the series really explores how attention to the body and to relationships that dance often holds can play a role in public and political life, and perhaps in social cohesion. So this talk series follows a structure that ID has been using for several years, whereby we offer a platform for conversation between two people from different practices or disciplines. And this means after brief introductions, much of what you'll listen to this evening is being co-created in a sort of back and forth dialogue between Marwa and Charlotte, rather than listening to prepared talks. So for tonight's event, we invited Charlotte, a choreographer, curator, performer, among other things, Charlotte Spencer. Charlotte's practice involves collaborating with people and environments to create performance encounters with audiences. These are often participatory, based in outdoor sites, such as her recent work that was shown here with Sadler's Wells, Is This a Wasteland? So we invited Charlotte to propose someone who she'd like to meet to further her ideas into choreographing in public spaces. And we're delighted that Syrian architect Marwa Al Saboni accepted the invite. Marwa is the author of the internationally acclaimed book, A Battle for Home, which is a memoir of her experiences as a female architect in war-torn Syria, and also the book Building for Hope, in which she explores how cities and buildings might rebuild in the aftermath of conflict or financial depression or crisis. Marwa is also this year's guest co-director of the Brighton Festival alongside Tristan Schartz, and Charlotte Spencer's work will also be presenting in Brighton Festival. So in a moment, I'm going to invite Marwa and then Charlotte to introduce themselves and their practices. And this is going to be followed by an unfolding conversation about how their concerns might intersect and how they also might develop to become social actions. Then in the final 30 minutes, there will be a chance for questions from the room and from the Zoom room. So those of you online can write your questions in the Q&A function. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat function and a Q&A function. So if you use the Q&A function for questions, I will then field those to the speakers in the room. And those of you in the room, you can just put your hand up and we'll be able to, I will also repeat the question so that it can be heard on Zoom. Any problems that anyone at home has with technical functions, they can write those in the chat and they will be dealt with by Johnny, who's hosting the chat space. So yeah, that's enough from me. I think firstly, I want to then introduce you to Marwa Al Sabouni, and Marwa is going to give a little short introduction with some images about her practice. Thanks, Marwa.
Thank you, Hani, for the introduction. And I just want to say it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you, although not physically with you, but I mean, I'm so excited and looking forward to the conversation with Charlotte. And it's also an exciting encounter between those two fields of art, the art of dance and the art of architecture. So I hope also the audience will enjoy our encounter and our conversation. I'll begin with introducing my work and where I focus in my work, and I will give you also an introduction to my city, because I believe my city has shaped in many ways my work. And I think also the event of that we lived here with in Syria, the war that has now been stretching over a decade or more so now, also have taught me a lot about my own practice. So I'm an architect by training and by practice, and I also have a PhD in architectural design and the Islamic architecture. So I practice engineering and also teaching sometimes. And I was introduced to the world of publishing and became an author by this, like I said, by the event of war. So basically, in 2011, the war broke in Syria here, and while I was living here with my family during the years of war, I was also studying for my PhD. And after that, the idea of writing about the relationship between war and architecture basically came out of the events that were unfolding outside of my building and looking at through my window. So I'll begin with sharing the slides. If the control room could show the first slide. This is Homs, my city. It's the third largest city in Syria, and it's a central province that stretches from the Mediterranean shores to the west into the Iraqi borders to the east. So it's the largest province actually in Syria. Homs is known by many names. One of them is related to the building materials and the natural stones, which is showing next slide. It's called the mother of the black stone, of the basalt stone. And those stones you see I hope the audience will bear with us while I'm saying next slide. So I hope it's not too inconvenient. So please show next slide, and you'll see how the terrain is mostly on a volcanic hill, and those stones were used from the beginning of building the city, basically in 2000 and 3000 BC, where Homs was called a Mesa. Next slide. And it's a beautiful nature that surrounds the city. where you can find this lake, and this lake basically was related also to the foundation of the city, because the city was built away from the Orontes river, because it was very swampy, and it's this relation with water as well. You can see how this relation with water also shaped the city. Next slide. So as you see from this image, the city is not exactly related now to nature and to the fields around and to the river that used to be juxtaposed to it. And this is basically something that I write about, how architecture basically separated us from many elements. One of the most important one was nature, and the other one is also the community bonding, and those relationships were affected by the way we build. Next slide, please. And again, you can see how those buildings, those block buildings, no longer related to the building material or the natural element that used to shape the city. Next slide, please. Again, next slide. I just flicker through here. This is the central square where we call it the old tower square, the old clock tower, sorry. And it's followed by the next slide where you will see the new clock tower, which is a funny way of looking at the city. Those two clock towers are just separated by one street, and this is the center of the city, which was also affected by war. You can see those images are from the time before war. Next slide. Next slide. This is one of the irrigation canals that also bring water to the city, and those canals also were affected by war and by certain decisions that city planners had made that also affected how the city looked and how the city evolved. Next slide, please. Can we flicker through several slides here that will show you the orchards and the weather in the city, because sometimes I found that out that it's not always known that it's just there is assumptions and stereotypes that we don't have snow, for example, or what kind of weather we have here in the Middle East, and it's not always the assumption that you'll see in those images. This is the Carque du Chevalier, one of the ancient castles that also is located near to Homs in the province, and it's in the western rural countryside to Homs. We can go to the next slide now. I'm just setting the context for you to get introduced to the place where I found home, and I also lost home sometimes, and it's the main focus of my first book. So this is this map shows you the destruction that or the severity of destruction that happened during the war, and you can see that almost all the city is destroyed, because it's all marked in various degrees of red that indicates different severities of damages. So from total destruction to partly destroyed areas. and it's estimated that more than 60% of the city is totally destroyed. We can move on to the next slide now. And we'll flicker here through those images where you could see entire neighborhoods being wiped out, basically. Could you please flicker through those? So those images show you the scale of destruction that took place here in Homs. And basically this destruction was, for me, was in a way, the motivation to look for reasons why this destruction happened. And in my own research, I found out that architecture and urban planning were main reasons we often overlooked, because basically the way the city evolved and the way city was transformed also was the way that we have lost touch with the city, and we have lost touch with the idea and the concept of home. And could you please flicker through those images? And in many ways, it didn't matter how we looked at home, and in a certain moment, it was easy to destroy this home because it didn't mean so much for so many people. And could you please pause here? This is an image that is taken from the old part, or the old city, where the ancient city, basically the ancient Homs, was located, and you could see how the urban context was very closely knitted, and you could see also how different religions lived side by side in a very beautiful, from what I see, in a very beautiful proximity. You had mosques next to churches, and you had houses very closely knitted, which also reflected itself onto community life and onto bonds between people, which has been affected by the alternative model that we built with. Could you flicker through those? So this is the following images will show you two of the main buildings that means a lot to the Homsi memory and to the Homsi culture. One is the Mosque of Khalid ibn al-Walid, which you see the interior now, and the other one is the Church of Saint Mary. Could you move to the next slide, please? This is the church. This is the interior of the church, and you could see both buildings were built by the same material. Those rocks that we saw in the first images, the black basalt. And could you move to the next image, please? And you can see also a certain sense of modesty that was related to this building material and to the shapes of those buildings. And this has been a shaping factor to the whole culture and the whole life of the city. Could you, next please? And those images show you the destruction and the damages that was inflicted on both of those buildings and on also many other buildings surrounding those. If we can move to the next image. This is the mosque after sustaining damages. Next, please. Yeah, we can move to flicker through several ones now, and they will show you how this image we saw of the Catholic Church and the mosque was also affected by the war. And this is in an entire neighborhood, which was also damaged, destroyed completely. And this one is taken from the souk, or from the old market, which also has taken a lot of hits and was destroyed too, but partly restored afterwards. Could you move next? Now we're back to the countryside, because in my work as well, especially in the second book, Building for Hope, I also explored this, the urban tactics and the urban transformation that took place both in the countryside and in the city, and how damaging the countryside was the reason behind the city all over the world, by the way, especially in the aftermath of the World War II, how the countryside was abandoned for the sake of industrialization, and how this affected also the relationship between communities and people and between land. Moving to the next slide, please. So this is from the chestnut wood, also in the western rural side. Flickering through now several slides. Yeah. And you could see that urbanization is crawling into the abandoned countryside, and it's basically because of the immigration from the rural or from the countryside into the city. The countryside has become a destination or a project for tourism. And all those buildings you see are vacant, basically vacant buildings during most of the year, and they are rented retreats during the months of the summer. But this meant that a lot of trees were cut off and a lot of lands were abandoned. Could we move next? Yeah, and flicker next, please. And believe it or not, this is not a city, this is a village. But as I said, because it has transformed into a touristic project, this is how the beautiful countryside has become. Moving on. Also, this is taken from the countryside, and you can see how the factory polluting the whole area. Next. Hani, may I check with the time if how are we doing with the time?
It's a little bit over now, but if you, yeah.
Okay, I'll just wrap up with a few images. If the images could move on while I'm speaking. So those are just to show you the pollution in the city, and I in my work I see all of these negative results interlinked into the way that into the way of transforming the city, and into the way that in the way that by taking the power from the people and by destroying the relationship between societies and the city is mostly sacrificed to the power of money and to the power of authority, which in our case led to war and destruction. I just want to flicker through images and move back to you, Hani and Charlotte.
Thanks so much, Marwa. I think we'll have a lot more opportunity to get into the sort of a lot of the reasons why you feel this has come about as we continue the conversation. But just for time's sake, why don't I just hand straight over to Charlotte, and Charlotte's going to introduce us to her practice.
everybody. Hang on a second. Just getting into my computer. Yeah, so lovely to be in conversation with you, Marwa, and to be here today. I'm Charlotte Spencer, in case some of you don't know. And just to give myself a short description, I'm a fair-skinned woman in my late 30s. I have long red and silver hair kind of wrapped in a plait around my head today. And I'm wearing a black short sleeve top and dark blue jeans. And when I was first talking with Nikki and Henny about this talk and who I might like to be in conversation with, Marwa came to my thoughts, I guess because I'd been in conversation with Tristan Sharps, the other guest director of Brighton Festival, about potentially presenting my work in the festival, and he had introduced me to Marwa's work, and I'd become interested in your thoughts about what leads to war and conflict, but also I guess what felt like it was sort of shared ground, and hopefully some of this evening will allow us to kind of have a conversation about that. So I'm going to start with saying a little bit about my work and my practice, its background and context, and maybe a bit more about what I'm attempting to do with my work and why I was interested in what the connections with Marwa's work might be. So I'm going to read a bit, and hopefully that will help me be a little bit more succinct and not too rambly. For those of you who don't know me, I trained as a dancer and now have been working for many years as a choreographer and director, making performances, installations, curating and hosting events, holding conversations and running workshops. And a significant part of my practice is also centered around teaching and facilitating choreography and creative practice in and with others. The more that I work in dance, the more that I feel it's my job to invite people into closer relationships with their moving bodies, with others and with the world around us. I am motivated by engaging with social and ecological questions and then trying to find ways to express those inquiries through intimate live encounters with audiences, whether that's a performance, a conversation, a workshop, a panel discussion, or simply a walk. Through my work, I feel like I am always questioning how and why choreography and dance are useful and applicable in the wider world. And that's not always an easy place to kind of sit in. So for sure, at times in my career, I've found myself wondering if I would be more effective or my energy would be kind of more directly pursued if I was, say, a social worker or working for Greenpeace or something. And yet I find myself kind of returning again and again to this unifying and incredibly powerful recognition that we all have a body and that meaningful felt experiences are what move us and shape us, change us and change our behavior. We experience life most immediately through our bodies. It constantly reminds us that we're alive and witnesses and responds to all other life. Our body gives us immediate feedback for how we're doing and who we are. And I think I try and tap into that. It's somehow really energizing. Throughout our lifetime, we are in constant movement, whether we're simply breathing, sleeping or resting, sitting at our desk and working, running or dancing, we're still always moving. And sometimes that moving is huge and full of expression and virtuosity, and sometimes it's so tiny that it's hardly visible at all. I try to create live encounters, performance encounters that enter our bodies in ways that can shift our perspective and build a greater sense of connection and care of our experience of ourselves, of our relationship with others, with place and with the world around us. And so for the past decade, my focus has been mostly on making performances outdoors. I found myself keen to present work in the midst of life, sort of not separated from it in a theatre or a studio. So in parks, on beaches, in public spaces, in places where the space between performance and stage and life are quite blurry. And I also realized that I wanted to engage people physically in their experience of the work. So rather than sitting and watching it, I became interested in making performances where audiences could encounter the work with their own bodies, where they could be both the performers and the audience at the same time. I'm not a usual candidate for participatory performance, I must say. I am naturally a bit shy and kind of hesitant in social situations. So I would probably not sign up for the kind of shows I've been making. And that's kind of an interesting conundrum when you're making them. But I actually think it's probably been kind of useful in my creative processes, because it's meant that always at the very front of my consideration is, how do we invite an audience in? How do we make an invitation that is welcoming, not exposing or humiliating for people, that they gradually feel like they can trust that you're not going to kind of pull the carpet away. And I guess that becomes part of the grounds of the work. How do we make a work that feels like it's for you and that you are okay to be here? And even if you're not okay to be here, that we can hold that too, and it's okay to leave. So with each project, oh yeah, it's going through the images, I didn't realize. Great, so these are all images from Is This a Wasteland? Different sites, different parts of the process of making. So within each project, I try to engage with the questions of the work in all aspects of how the project is realized. And that might sound obvious, but I don't think it's actually always normal. So not just in the content of the performance, but this includes how we structure the creation, how we work with the performers, how we build connections with audiences, partners, and funders. And in the context of making outdoor performances, this has often led to making processes that are deeply embedded in the landscape, where there is a focus on working with the site rather than simply kind of on it. And my experience has been that this requires a lot of time and spending long durations in and with the place or places, taking time alone and with others to notice what is already there, to listen, to smell, to play, to be open with all our senses, to feel what a place is offering before we start making our own marks or imprints on it. And with a previous work, Walking Stories, that led to a kind of making process that was across England and France. We cycled by bicycle more than 3,000 kilometers across the landscape to make this work, which sort of seemed crazy, and lots of people asked me, even the team, like why we were doing it. But for me, I guess it felt really important to be, if we were going to invite our audience to take a journey through a landscape, even if it's a short one in a park for 1 hour, that we, the makers of it, needed to be on a big journey through a landscape ourselves in order to try and do justice to the making of what that work became. And with Is This a Wasteland, which I'm about to talk more about, that work, I guess, in direct kind of response to the experience of constantly moving with Walking Stories, it was a project that was more about kind of a sense of occupation and building a feeling of belonging and home to a place. So it was sort of located in a few very particular locations where we spent long durations of time through the making process. So I wanted to talk a little bit about two works. This one, Is This a Wasteland, and a new work that I am starting rehearsals for tomorrow, which is Written in the Body, which will be part of Brighton Festival in May this year. Is This the Wasteland was a performance through headphones created for vast disused urban spaces. I think some people in the audience have joined me on this venture. We made it in 2014, between 2014 and 2017, took 3 years, and then restaged it again in 2021. So we kind of spanned a sort of 7-year process. Designed for up to 100 audience members and 6 performers, the audience respond to instructions or invitations amidst a detailed sound score. Gradually, they realize they're not all hearing the same thing. Indeed, there are 5 separate strands of audio material that are sort of intricately interwoven and running simultaneously. This means we can start to build intricate series of sort of interactions with different audience groups within the piece. The work lasts for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and everyone is involved in working with objects to build things with their hands and their bodies, to pull them down, to make new things. The landscape keeps on changing, morphing, becoming something else. Sometimes people are working together in groups, sometimes alone, sometimes in direct conflict with each other. The encounter is physical and tactile and sometimes confusing. The piece takes place at dusk. It starts in daylight and finishes around a fire, drinking hot chocolate, eating biscuits, and chatting as the light disappears, whilst we burn some parts of the kind of materials from the work. It is a piece that tries to grapple with the complexity of our relationships, of how we value our land, our homes, and material things, how we respond to autonomy, co-responsibility, and authority. It began with this really big question: how can we live with positivity and hope in times of crisis? And I know it doesn't provide really maybe any answers. And for myself, at least in the process, it definitely brought up lots more questions, but it does try to engage with how we can be together even in challenging times. And I think the process of making it was a lot about that as a creative team. How can we be in this place together and ask these questions about what makes us feel like we belong, what makes us feel like we're at home, what builds a sense of community or doesn't, and how can we try and share that with an audience. It took 3 years to make the work, repeatedly hampered by not being granted permission to work on these empty, disused sites. And then it took another 4 years before we presented it again last autumn with Sadler's Wells at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park and with Dance North in Scotland. It was delayed in part by the global pandemic. These questions about collectivity and shared experience and gathering felt all the more heightened last September for those of you who joined us, following almost 2 years of very little social interaction and contact. Artistically, I was curious to work in these empty places, to acknowledge what thrived, to participate in conversations about how we might imagine and animate our future spaces, to provide a space that maybe was made possible a sort of wilder or more feral, more tactile version of ourselves than we normally permit ourselves or are even indeed permitted in public spaces. Presenting the work on the very sites of change brought the themes of the project to the places where they were living. And the making of this work coincided with the mounting tensions of the migration crisis across Europe amidst the Syrian civil war, resulting in all the emergent and transient refugee camps on European frontiers. It also coincided with the Brexit referendum here in the UK and Donald Trump coming into power in the US, with his pledges for building walls along the border with Mexico. National borders that let some in and keep others out according to where you happen to have been born don't feel so different from the seemingly arbitrary boundaries drawn up between land that we can and can't access in our own home towns and cities. This project has become a vehicle for inviting audiences onto spaces that perhaps are no longer accessible to the general public, and to offer an albeit temporary sense of occupancy and co-ownership of a place. Through the performance, walls are built and pulled down again. Parts of the space are roped off and then dismantled. With our hands and our bodies, we make and unmake this place together. The performance is created by all of those who arrive to experience it. Once the piece is running, we, the creative team, have very little control in how people interpret or respond to the instructions that we've devised. It is different from sitting and having a conversation. Here, our questions are brought to life through the body as physical experience, in direct relationship with the landscape that we travel in. With my new work, Written in the Body, I'm returning to working in a theatre context after more than a decade of focusing on presenting work outside. This new work will explore ideas about memory, tactility, touch, and consent. Some people are saying to me, oh, this is a big departure. And in some ways, I guess it is, but also for me, it really isn't. It's a kind of, how do we bring this in? How do we bring those considerations of outside into the inside? It's a piece about giving more attention to our experiences of sensation. We're bringing with us this sort of wealth of curiosity and experience of making participatory performances outdoors and seeing how that connects with the controlled environment of a theatre, its limitations, codes, and also its freedoms. I find myself thinking a lot about the space of the theatre, the foyer, the bar area, the journey for the audience, what those spaces feel like to be in, what to make use of, and what to try and undo. Touch is the first sense that develops in utero. It is vital for survival in newborn babies and helps them to regulate body temperature. It calms and soothes. It helps our digestive system to develop, as well as supporting mental and emotional development. It is our primary language, fundamental to human communication, bonding, and health, and is our primary means for the spread of compassion and empathy. Skin is the largest organ in the body. It's a membrane by which we meet the world and it meets us. And in these complex times of polarization and division, of fear and aggression, and in that breath, I sort of must include what's happening in the Ukraine right now. And I'm sure that we're all kind of with those people distracted and wondering what to do. So I bring this question, I guess, of this new work around sensation, tactility, and touch, of like, is there a useful place for touch in this dilemma? I know it's really complicated. Still, I find myself coming back to the body and to connection. Is it possible to attend to our differences from a place of embodiment? And does that help with building bridges of empathy, understanding, and connection? I don't know. If we all gave more value to how a space or a place or an environment makes us feel, rather than simply how it looks or how much money it might make us, would that change what we make, what we protect, and how we behave? Just want to spend the last minute or so sort of connecting with Marwa's work, and then we can keep talking. As I heard about Marwa's work and read her books, I was struck by a feeling of a shared approach. And you might disagree with me, Marwa, but I felt like a shared approach to practice, albeit from different disciplines and a very different lived experience of the world. I was drawn to her perspective that articulates so clearly how integral the relationship between how we feel about a place or a space and how it invites us to interact, to behave, to feel at home or not, to feel part of something or not. How that architecture and city planning must surely be as much about how buildings make us feel as much as how they look. And I think the same about dance and performance. When I'm in the process of making new work, I spend a lot of time considering the whole of the experience, from before it begins until after it's finished, for the creative team and what their journey will be, for the audience. And this sort of whole also prioritizes how the experience might feel to encounter, how we bring all of ourselves and all of our histories and all of our senses with us. We can't not do that. And so a performance is and can never be something simply to watch. It is also something that we live and experience, like even right now, yeah. Like your day that's brought you here and all the things and how your body's doing and whether you're cold or hot or uncomfortable or not, like that's with us. And I'll leave it there for now, I think, and look forward to unpacking some more stuff together. These sort of threads of differing practice, curiosity, experience, and perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Thanks both of you, Marwa and Charlotte. It's amazing to have these very different, but I'm already feeling this. I get what you mean about this connection or intersection that you might have. There are a lot of ways that we could jump in here, but maybe we just jump in with a simple connection that I felt both today, but also when we spoke earlier in last month. where both of you speak about notions of belonging and home and the importance of that. And I think notions of belonging and home are very complicated, because any sort of containment creates a sort of inside and an outside. It creates a border. And I know, Marwa, you've spoken a lot about different kinds of groups and how they can be alongside each other, but also divided. And you talk a lot about sort of sectarianism. So yeah, I just wonder if that maybe is a good place to start, the notion of belonging, how to create one, a sense of belonging, why it's important in well-being, and maybe you could both speak about that from the role of architecture and choreography and design. I don't know who wants to start.
Yeah, I guess maybe like I can say something and then Marwa can say something also. I was thinking, no, so say Marwa, you start.
I muted myself. Yeah, I think we both ask the same questions, basically. Listening to you, Charlotte, and looking at your work, it's just, you know, it's amazing how those different fields of practice ask very similar questions, how we engage in our built world and with our surroundings. You look at engaging with your body and your senses, and also architecture as well also speaks to the bodies and affect the senses. And a lot of I think a lot of mistakes that modern architecture did is to ignore those two entities, or this entity, the body and the senses, and by being insensitive towards those concepts, it contributed to the loss of meaning and the loss of belonging. And Henny, when you mentioned sectarianism, there is a lot to say about sectarianism, but I would like to begin by the idea of segregation and how urban segregation and how alienation, physical alienation, could contribute into heightening differences. And this is what I believe happened to a lot of to a great sense here in my own country, because looking historically, I mean, Syria has been a place of multicultural and different ethnicities and religions and backgrounds living together from millennials. And Damascus, for example, is the oldest continuously inhabited capital in the world, is one of those great examples where different religions and different backgrounds lived physically and also socially side by side, with a great success for so many years. The question is, and this is a question I asked in my own work, what has changed? How come it's a torn place? How come it's a place of civil war, of killing? And I think this segregation, this urban segregation, and this alienation from place by uglifying the place is something that we should take seriously, and is something that is one of the main reasons. It's not the only reason behind this end result, but it's one of the main reasons why we as societies have lost touch with each other, and why we kind of became introverted, and we had this this you know, this notion about the other that we do not encounter anymore, and we do not share a place and with, and this is basically I think this is a recipe for sectarianism and the disaster that followed.
Yeah, I think there's lots to say there. I guess maybe rather than sort of indirect answer, just maybe some more observations is maybe interesting or useful. Because so one set of thoughts that I have been thinking about and was part of the work with Is This a Wasteland, and it feels really connected with some of your observations, Marwa, sort of like how the design of buildings and streets and areas within towns and cities is a kind of, it is a kind of choreography in a way. It does or doesn't encourage exchange or chance encounter. It does or doesn't encourage meeting places or resting places or a variety of identities and cultures to be there or not be there. I think we can all think of examples of places where we feel like it's okay to relax, or it's just definitely not okay to relax. And actually, when I was doing some of the research for Is This a Wasteland, came to realize how much of our what we think of as public spaces are really heavily regulated and ruled, and they're often also like privately owned. So if you do start to have a picnic with 3 people, you just literally get moved on. So how we literally move through a space has become often quite didactic here in this country I'm talking about, and how we feel to be in a space, what we feel is possible or not possible in terms of how we move is also being kind of heavily prescribed. And so that's like, that becomes wrapped up in like in urban development and city planning. And I guess historically it was a more organic development that happened over like decades and centuries of like some of these images that Marwa had of like a mosque and a church right next to each other in a residential area. And I know in your book, some of what you were talking about is that like you wouldn't know who was rich and who was poor by their homes. You wouldn't know whether they were Muslim or Christian from just like the area of the city. It was these places were sort of melting pots of identity and culture and exchange, and the marketplace was also super important for that. And I guess I noticed that we're in a time of like that is sort of eking away, and this sort of also shift to the online of everything in terms of including purchasing means we have so little of these interactions. So then there's a question, like as a choreographer or a person involved in choreographic practice, like, okay, I'm not a city planner, I don't have influence in that, it's also not my expertise, but I think some of what I've been trying to do in the public realm is like kind of, we were talking about it earlier, sort of like, can we kind of put a chink in it? Can we like question it a bit, or like kind of undo that experience a little bit? And the work of Is This a Wasteland, not on public spaces, but in these places where we needed to have permission to be there, and the next day we would have been trespassing if we were there. But often when we first arrived, we kind of didn't know what to do there, because it was like, there are no rules really here. There isn't anything that's kind of clear about where we should go or how we should inhabit this place. And there was sort of like, there's not really, and there's also kind of it's sort of a nothing place, or a place that's in between, or that's been abandoned or left behind. And then there was this sort of gradual process of like becoming familiar with it and sort of falling in love with it almost, noticing what was there and what was thriving. And there was a kind of unruliness to that almost, like in terms of sort of nature is strong. And then trying to find ways to invite audiences to feel like they can also claim some of that space for themselves. So I'm not quite sure where I'm going, but I feel like there's many of these like trying to find what role we might have in dance practice around some of these questions.
Well, I suppose again, this is to both. It's something about when you say, you know, you encounter a nothing place. And so it could be for all sorts of reasons that it's a nothing place and you chose these particular wasteland places, but as well in terms of, you know, the images we've just seen of Syria that have somehow been destroyed, and there's a sort of nothing, you know, there is always stuff left, but there is a sort of not knowing where to go from here. And I'm kind of curious about how in both architecture and choreography, there's a sense that they're design practices to a degree. And when you have a project to design something, how does that start? How do you go about it? Is there some kind of top-heavy ideology that you begin with, or is it about creating conditions where, like you're talking about conditions where participation might occur and where something might emerge, kind of emergent conditions? I don't know if that's a useful question for you to start with again, Marwa, but also just in terms of when you're in your second book, when you also talk about designs for reconstruction and how you might begin there, be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, the problem, again, the problem with modernity that, by the way, I should flag out that I don't mean to generalize here. I'm not speaking about any modern construct. I'm speaking about modernity as an ideology that you know, was born in the aftermath of the two great wars, and as an ideology, it was about changing ideals. It was about bringing new ideals instead of the old set that was believed to lead to those wars. And the problem was, at least for us here in the region, that this model was enforced upon us by colonization. It was introduced as a model to take by force, and till this day we follow this model as if it was sent by God or something. It's just, you know, we have lost touch with our identities as a result, and it's one of the reasons why we struggle with this identity crisis here in this part of the world. But I think, for at least it's my approach, it's my belief that architecture should start from the context, and you hear now more and more voices from modern architects and from international architects taking context in consideration. And this context means that you look at geography and typology, and you look at building materials, and you look at climate, but also you should look at the social context. You should look at history, at religion, and all of those elements are factors of design, are determinate factors of how the architect should kind of interwove all of these threads into a creative construct in order to, and it's this challenge, it's the design challenge, which thread to bring to the fore and which one to leave in the background. And it's a very complex process, but because of the nature of our era, because of the speed and the globalized way of doing things, we often do not have time to process those elements, those factors, and to digest this into a meaningful construct.
There's so much in what you say, Marwa, that sort of resonates really strongly for me. I guess like this, brings me back to this question about taking care of the whole, like trying to take care of all of these interwoven considerations that are complex, and to try and make them simple is like actually to it's reductive, and that's like a kind of process of almost like steamrollering something, which is like, rather than trying to wrap our heads around the complexity, and know that that's also something to celebrate in terms of multiplicity of identity and opinion and perspective and culture, and that it is a big challenge, but it feels like it's a really important one not to kind of shy away from. And some of what you were saying about this, I guess, like, we're in this time of like the post-industrialization and sort of technological moment of like trying to make as much as possible, as quickly as possible, for as much money as possible. And it doesn't work really like that. Like, what loses out, it feels like what suffers is the people. Like, that's what really massively desperately suffers is the people. And that, like, it also totally doesn't work for our sector in the arts, because it like really skews where value is. So like, it takes a long time, it takes a lot of time and care and kind of craftsmanship to make a dance performance. It costs way more money to make it than it's like ever going to make, or for most shows, unless they go to the West End. And this is like this constant dilemma, I guess, like, and how can we free frame our set of values, or like where we place value, that's like not just on like the quickest, the biggest, the most, like the thing that's going to make us the most money. And it feels like that should be super important about how we design our spaces, and particularly our homes. But I know that at least in this country, and I think probably also in Syria before the war, like the sort of value system had got so skewed that property was not really about a home and a shelter. It was like about an investment, and like trying to make as much money for a few people as possible. And this is like, has totally undone us, I guess.
True. Absolutely.
Yeah. Just being aware of time, I'm wondering if you both okay if we start like the invitation to open to questions. Sure. So anyone who has a question can raise their hand, or I haven't got anything in the chat yet, but in the meantime, yeah, I just wanted to something you've both spoken about is a kind of generosity of design, generous designs that might have opportunities for exchange built in them.
Yeah, I'd love Marwa to say a bit more about how you.
It's your turn now.
No, but in relation to generosity, I love this notion of, and I think about it with buildings and the built environment and places that I get drawn to, about sort of buildings and spaces and environments that keep on giving, like that it does. And I'd love for you to say a little bit more about that, because you'll say it better than me.
Not at all. Yeah, in my second book, I address the idea of generous buildings, and I think it's something that most of our cities strive for, because in many ways our architecture and our building environment has become mean. And I think this is related again to how city has become a place for money and services instead of place of trade and exchange as it used to be. And I think the idea of city was about people meeting and trading. Is, you know, the craftsmanship of a city is production and trade, in comparison, for example, with the traditional occupation of the countryside, which is agriculture. So in the book, I look at generosity, or define generosity as an act of not only giving, it's an act of taking and giving. It's an act of exchange, because as much as giving is considered generosity, taking as well is also generosity, because it implies trust, and it implies also the acceptance of future giving back. And in our built environment, we are losing, as you were speaking about your project, is this a wasteland? Those leftovers, if you will, in the city, those abandoned places are mostly places where seating is prohibited, walking through is prohibited. There is a price tag on the experience of cities more and more, because it's being transformed into an investment sector instead of place of exchange. And I mean, in those spots that survived this act of meanings is you could look at places where a water fountain is free for you to drink, or there is a fruitful tree for you to pick from, and there is room for you to sit for free in a public square, or also there is a free sight of beauty, and there is a free sight of free experience which the city is giving to you. And in that sense, I think this extension of kindness from the built environment definitely inspire us and invite us to give back and to belong.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if anyone has a question, because we can keep on asking each other questions.
Yeah, so I'll repeat that so that people on the Zoom and Marwa can hear. So the question's around the countryside, really, and it's directed to Marwa as well as Charlotte, I think, because we've spoken a lot about the city and sort of trade and exchange, but the question asks, what therefore would you say, what does the countryside sort of represent, or what is its value now in this current climate context? Does that feel, yeah. So yeah, the countryside is such a great name as well.
Well, I think, yeah, I think it's important to revive agriculture as not as a business, you know, for private companies and for stakeholders, but as a craftsmanship of residents of the countryside, because the countryside globally has become a place of retreat or tourism or investment, and in that sense, it's like an extension. I think it's threatening to the very existence of the countryside and to the human, also the human race, because agriculture becoming a private enterprise is something that, you know, that we have encountered the risks of during the pandemic, and how food safety has become an issue, and how, you know, you hear about food security and how people should, you know, worry about the production of their own food, and how people, you know, in the pandemic, how supermarkets became this place of chaos and place of sometimes of conflict as well, because we've lost touch with land, and because basically because agriculture has been privatized, and the countryside basically moved into the city. And this, in my view, creates a double, double the trouble, because you have the city that is, we always facing the conundrum of how to plan a city for all of those, for the inflation of people, and how most 75% of the global population will be city citizens in 2050, for example. And there is no way that the city will keep growing and you will represent equality or justice for all of those people. You have people who will live on the fringes and live away and pay for more transportation and be in more crowded places, and in places they do not in any way find as homes, as places of convenience and comfort, whereas the countryside is being abandoned and privatized, and also being evacuated from its own inhabitants. So I think the solution is to go back to agriculture and to find ways of preserving this occupation, this craftsmanship.
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's also very complicated, like how our relationship with the rural environment. And as you were saying, Marwa, like farming has been kind of sort of industrialized, and we're living in a time of like kind of very large farms with very few people doing the farming, and so a few people profiting from these large swathes of land, much of which has become like not accessible to the general public. So we've got this sort of double severing, isn't it? Like a kind of severing from our natural environment, and also the natural environment getting sort of less and less sort of natural, because it's like sprayed constantly with pesticides, and like it's transformed into a place that is about kind of mass food production, but not really like nurturing of the ground. And this, like for me, is just as representative of some of the other toxic things we've been, or difficulties or breakdowns that we've been talking about in terms of community, also in terms of like what's happening in the ground and our relationship or our connection or lack of with that natural environment. So if there is a possible way forwards to not go back in time, but to return in some way to small scale farming, I think it would be extremely beneficial. But at the moment, I don't see any way for that to be possible in this country, with how kind of the economic structure for farming is kind of established.
Yeah, there's actually a question in the chat that really relates to this, that means I'm skipping this person ahead, but Caroline Spencer, do you think that the old concept of the stewardship of the land or a place or a historic building is more generous than the current trend towards privatized ownership? The stewardship, is that more generous than?
In what way? I mean, I'm not sure I understand.
No.
Yeah.
Can you read it again?
Do you think that the old concept of stewardship of the land or a place or historic building, so I guess by stewardship, it's not ownership, it's like management and being a caretaker.
But like in a feudal system, or like what?
Well, I guess as an old concept, I'm assuming that that's what is meant.
Because there's still problems there, right?
But is it more generous than the current trend towards private ownership?
Well, in my book, I introduce one of the experiences that was used in the Ottoman era, where basically the government was leasing swaths of land to farmers, and because it has it had to deal with drought and with war and with abandoned lands. And the legislation or the approach was called the Maryland legislation, and it's a very interesting experience that I detail in the book about how this how the Ottomans at the time had revived the countryside by incentives and by introducing leases that were fair for farmers, and they could basically they could extend the inheritance to their of the lease to many generations, which made the agricultural enterprise worthwhile. So I think there are ways to explore in old experiences, old traditions, and not necessarily learn from mistakes of the past, but also look for those successful experiences and reintroduce to the countryside.
Oh, sort of moving on slightly, but in response, can I just say, it
Yeah.
feels like there's something that keeps coming up that's about like, can we find a way to let our structures be more on a human scale, and where there is enough space and time to take care? And it's something I know we talk about in our sector quite a lot at the moment, especially post-pandemic, of like, how can we not go back to the same ways that we were operating before, where we're kind of running around like headless chickens constantly, and for what? So like, is there a way that we can take more care of our places, of each other, of our bodies? Is there a way to be industrious, but like at more of a human scale that means it's maybe less overwhelming for ourselves? And there's something about craftsmanship as well that I think is coming up, both in what Marwa talks about in her books in relation to the built environment, but also maybe in relation to farming. And I think it relates to our work in dance, is that like, we're not making dance with robots primarily. It's like not industrialized like in the same way, because it kind of can't be. And there's something really that I think is sort of beautiful about that it's still primarily a world where we're making with our bodies and it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of kind of intricacy and craft in that, in whatever way you're like presenting work on a stage. Like, I'm not talking about like just through ballet or something, but
yeah, although I mean it's not industrialized, but there is a sort of sense of expectation within maybe certain kinds of dance that is put on a body, that where it becomes more of a sort of machine type instrument.
Yeah.
So there's something in thinking about that I would consider.
Yeah.
There are other questions.
Yes,
Maybe we have one from the room. Yeah, would you like to go? Thank you. So that's a question, actually relates to one of the questions that's in the chat as well. So that's really good. So in everything that's come up about hardship and the crisis, the war and the crisis, how as an artist do you stay hopeful? And so there was a question in the chat where they asked, could you say something about the role of hope and how they sustain hope in their work? It's a big one.
Do you want to go?
I can try. Yeah. I won't do it all justice for sure. I think, like I've said many times this evening, I guess, I come back to the body, and the body is like, for as long as we're alive, it keeps on like being full of potential or something. And I remember talking to a neuroscientist recently in relation to my new work, about kind of how elastic our brains are actually, like until we die, that they even as we get older and frailer and things maybe stop working, that still there's like this sort of great elasticity which is full of potential. So I think that holds me a lot. And then I think this is also what keeps me in making live work, live performance, why I felt like it was so important to return from the pandemic with live performance, is this thing that we share in it together, that we share in this moment, and that trying to find ways of being together, of working together, even in the conflict or the difficulty, is a galvanizing experience generally. And there's, we haven't spoken so much about it this evening, but there's something interesting for me about like the relationship between the individual and the collective, the shared. And I think there is a lot that is still shared that that unites us. And I guess that is a force of hope, and also a force for trying to live a life that feels that it is meaningful. And it's also something that Marwa talks about and that I feel strongly attached to, is like you can have all the stuff in the world, you could have all the money and all the gizmos and all the flashy whatevers, but that doesn't necessarily create meaning. And then you get to the end of your life and it's like, what was that for? What was the point of it? And so in many ways, I guess like what I'm always trying to make and to find and to make possible is building connection with myself and with others, with place, and that in that process life becomes meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautifully said, Charlotte. I don't know if I have much to add to it, because what I wanted to say is hope is, for me, hope is relies on your understanding of the meaning of life. So if you I mean, it is related to those existential questions about why are we here, and what's the purpose of life, and what I am, you know, what am I supposed to do? And I think it's part of our struggle, and it's part of our strife in life to find the answers to those questions. And hope, basically, I think for me is to try to do good in life, you know, to find your positive contribution, and how you can you know, place this gift you're giving, or this meaning that you found in it's you know, just place it in the world, and do something meaningful. And that's basically, I think for me, it's basically how I process hope.
Thank you. We're coming to the sort of end of time, but what I thought I might do, because there are actually a load more questions in the chat now that are all really quite lovely, I might just read them anyway, because I think it's quite a nice thing to just sort of share some of the thoughts and questions that have come into the room, so that we can all go home feeling really fed by each other as well. But we probably won't have time to really address each of these questions. So I'm just gonna so there's a nice one, Angela Woodhouse. I want to thank you both for sharing your work so beautifully. I'm heartened to give thought to generosity as both giving and taking that reflects not personal gain, but communal gathering, giving agency through deep listening. And then the question is, how can we allow this way of living to overcome the autocracy and the destruction we have seen and are seeing again? We have another one from Kirsten. How do bodies stay integrated in the architectural design process? Is there a space for dance practice in this process? That's like, off you go, sort that out, both of you. Where am I? Anne Baumgart, do either of you consider the role of women when thinking about our experiences of the city and built environments, seeing as most of urban space is designed by men and for men, without taking into account women's needs? Is this a factor either of you actively address in your work? How can alternative approaches to design offer new ways for women to experience public space? Great question. this is not so much a question, but to acknowledge a curiosity in hearing about motions of construction and notions, sorry, I think that's notions of construction and deconstruction, both wanted and invited in relation to change. Is there a way in which performance can generate this kind of generosity? What can performance do? Wow. And then Susan Sadler, considering the word curation, the Latin to take care of, in inverted commas, the whole, to take care of the whole through architecture, urban planning, a specific artistic work or works, questioning how, when to place, situate, overlay the multiple, the singular, how appropriate curation can become a value. That's a really nice thought. This is anonymous. We love the spaces that just evolved and were planned. So how do we begin for the unplanned? How do we plan for the unplanned? Sorry. It's wonderful to see in the embryonic exercise of an hour's interaction and negotiation. But how to extend this to the built environment? Should we be reinforcing the risk of the shantytown rather than tear it down and build top-down safety? Provocative. Rachel, there are ways that, sorry, I'm reading. There are some ways that either dance or architecture can raise awareness of the value of the city away from this place of profit and wealth towards a place of generosity and welcoming spaces that enable social interaction. That was a question. Are there ways that either dance or architecture can raise awareness of the value of the city away from a place of profit and wealth towards a place of generosity and welcoming spaces that enable social interaction? Well, that really kind of sums up a lot of the questions as a further question. I don't know that we've necessarily resolved or given the answers to those questions, whether that's even possible in this short time. I wonder if either of you just want to have a final comment on any of that.
Charlotte?
Yeah, I'm sort of swimming with those questions, I guess, and feeling like this is a starting place. And I think it is totally possible to design places and dance practices within the context of generosity and care. It just, the value kind of system has to reorient itself, and I feel like there is appetite for that, but like whether there's like, it's hard to move against the tide, I guess, like to not be kind of pulled into the stream of capitalism, essentially. Like, yeah, but yeah. Yeah,
I also think that it's definitely possible. It's not only possible, it's the way that things should be. I mean, we are often disencouraged by those who benefit from the status quo, and I think it's in my work, I mean, especially in my second book, I introduce tactics and experiences that has been tried in the past, that has proved to be solutions for such situations. And like Charlotte said, it's there is definitely need and also voices that are, you know, demanding that that things should change, and things should, you know, there are certain mistakes that should be corrected, and certain policies that should be amended, and the appetite is definitely there. So it's up to us to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good closing point. It's up to us. I mean, I know sometimes it feels like we're in these structures where we have really little room for maneuver, but on a small scale, I guess that's like what I can manage is like, how do I operate? How do I interact? How do I manage projects and deal with people? And how do I try and kind of uphold the principles for which I'm talking about this evening, and that trying to trust and believe that that kind of ripples out and that that has an impact. And I know that that's also like a big attempt of what ID is doing, and not just yourselves, but that there is an appetite, and it's that I'm not alone in it.
Thank you. That is all we have time for. We're a bit over, but it's been amazing to hear you both speak together. I want to deeply thank Marwa for joining us from Homs. It's sort of fantastic. There are fantastic things about technology.
Yeah, it's so very late for her now, so she needs to go to bed.
Yeah, you do need to go to bed. It's super late. And I know you have
Thank
an
you so
early
much for
start.
having me, and thank you so much for all the questions, and for you, Charlotte and Henny, for this amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.